I'm Sherri from A Quilting Life, and today we're going to talk about making string blocks. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit like if you enjoy this video. And you can also leave comments or questions on the channel or on the blog. Now today we're going to talk about making these fun scrappy blocks, and it will have you never throwing away a scrap again. So today we're going to talk about the method I use to make my string quilt blocks, and I like to use a fabric foundation. You can also use used dryer sheets or thin paper if you'd like. Now if you use the paper or the dryer sheets, you might want to tear that off. The dryer sheets you could do either way, you could leave the background on. With this fabric foundation, I go ahead and leave it on. It makes the quilt blocks just a tiny bit heavier, but it really doesn't matter that much in the end. So what you're going to do is start out with a square that's a little bit bigger than the one you want your finished block to be. So my blocks are 1/2 inch bigger, 1/4 inch on each side all the way around. What I do first is I pick 2 fabric strips. Now, I have quite a collection of fabric strips left over from other projects. I just kind of save them in a bag, and when I get a good mix, I make a few string blocks. I generally like to use strips that are between 1 1/4 inches and 2 inches wide. Some of these really tiny strips you can use, but it's going to give you just a really narrow strip when you're finished. So yeah, you can see that these strips are all, they're different sizes, but they're not too wide or too narrow. So what you're going to do is you're going to put 2 strips, or strings as they're called, right sides together on top of your foundation piece. And I just make sure I cover both diagonal, corners. And I'm going to sew these with a 1/4 inch seam on one side. Once I've done that, you can see I sewed that seam and I pressed it to the one side. So I've got my centerpiece and they're sewn all the way through the foundation piece. And now I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to add strips to this side. I'm going to sew and press until I've completely covered my block, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to sew strips and press that way until I've completely covered my block. So I've continued sewing all of my strips to the piece that I started with, and you'll notice that I just used a little square on this side. Sometimes when you get to the end, a square works better than a long string, so save your little square pieces of fabric too. I used 1/4 inch seams for everything, and my center strip, I pressed 1/2 of them to one direction and 1/2 of them to the other. I'll show you what it looks like on the back. So you can see all of the seams that were sewn, and you can tell that my foundation piece of fabric is completely covered. Now we're ready for the fun part, and we're going to trim. And we're going to trim everything up to, my square fabric that I started with was 6 1/2 inches. I'm actually going to trim everything just to 6 inches because that's what I've started with, and I have a bunch of these blocks already made. So I'm going to line the ruler, and I'm going to just trim. And if there are small pieces that are left over like this, I just throw them away. Trim the next side. Now here you'll see I have a pretty good piece left. And so what I'm going to do at this is I'm going to save it. I'm going to just kind of chop it off, and I'm going to add this back to my string pile. We're going to continue around the edge of the block. and then we'll trim up that fourth side. And what we have left is a perfect string block. And I will come back and I'll show you a little bit about how you can set these together. And like I mentioned, if you had done this with an old dryer sheet background, you could leave it on or leave it off, but if you've used paper, you'll want to tear off the paper in between the seam allowances. These are a great way to use up scraps, and they're slightly addictive. So we finished making our string block, and now let me show you a few things that you can do when you put them together. I like to sew them together in groups of 4 as soon as I get them sewn. And you can tell that I've pressed the seam allowances open on the back. This is going to give this pattern up and down. You can offset the next row if you want to create more of a zigzag effect, or you can set them all so that you have the 4 squares all coming together. There's a lot of different options for how you can set these together. They're just so much fun, such a great way to use up scraps, and they make really durable quilts when they're finished. I hope you enjoyed all this information today about string blocks. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, and if you enjoyed today's content, hit the like button. As always, you can leave questions or comments on the channel or on the blog. Thanks so much for stopping by.